Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Implementing Value-Based Pricing in Under 1 Year. My name is Paul Carfinella, and I'm Marketing Program Manager here at LeveragePoint. I'd like to welcome you all to one of our monthly webinars on value-based strategies in pricing, product management, marketing, and sales, sponsored by LeveragePoint. At LeveragePoint, we provide the only software solution for value-based pricing. We offer a cloud-based collaboration platform that supports product innovation as well as sales enablement. And this changes the way that companies create, communicate, and capture value. You can find out more about us from our website, LeveragePoint.com. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone will be muted during today's presentation, but you are able to ask questions at any time by typing them into the question panel on the right-hand side. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we'll answer as many questions as time allows. Also, if you complete a brief, free-question online survey, which will appear as you exit the webinar, you'll be entered into a drawing to win the very popular new pricing book, the ROI of Pricing. Now my pleasure to introduce my colleague and LeveragePoint Vice President of Products and co-founder, Ed Arnold. Ed has 25 years of worldwide consultancy and training experience. At LeveragePoint, he directs product design and development and drives go-to-market strategy. He also leads LeveragePoint's customer adoption programs, providing training and support and coaching to customers. His chapter, Making the Case for Value-Based Pricing Software in B2B Markets, was featured in the popular book, The ROI of Pricing. Ed, welcome, and thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to move to the title slide here. And hello to everyone who's attending this webinar live today, as well as those who will be watching this recording in the future. My intent today is to focus on a real important topic, which is hardly ever covered in presentations like these. And that topic is, how do I implement a value-based pricing strategy in my organization? And how do I do that quickly, under a year? And by that I mean, what are the steps you need to take if you're tasked with this goal? And where do you start? So this presentation, I hope, will offer some practical answers to those questions based on the experience of working with dozens of companies on this exact task over the last few years at LeveragePoint. And I would say that LeveragePoint probably has more hands-on experience working with customers in this area than anyone else I know. So hopefully these insights will be useful, and I also look forward to responding to your specific questions a little later on. So just a quick nod to why value-based strategy is so important. At this point, there really should be no debate about whether a value-based strategy makes any sense. I'm sure many of you are aware of the research that shows that. This is a slide from a Monitor Group study a few years back ago, a very well done large-scale study showing a 24% profit advantage. And we've seen studies from Deloitte and McKinsey with similar results. And for some of those who listened to our webinar back in February, we had more recent data that was presented by Dr. Stefan Liozu in his annual State of Value-Based Pricing survey. And if you're interested in more details on that, we do have a recording on our website. So no doubt, value-based strategy, very, very important. Very, very effective, at least compared to other types of pricing strategies. So if you look at these blue bars here, you'll see cost plus pricing versus competition versus economic and value-based pricing. And, people acknowledge it, but people also acknowledge, if you look at that x-axis on the bottom, is that it's a more complex strategy. In other words, it takes more effort to do this. And because of this, I think companies have jumped to the conclusion that it's not worth the effort to switch methods, especially if their current pricing strategy seems to be delivering the appropriate levels of profitability. Dr. Nagel disagrees with that. And in a recent interview, he made the claim that value-based strategy is no longer what you would call a nice-to-have, but it's really a must-have. And there's a great white paper, which we'll be happy to share with you, that outlines the reasons why, at least in today's economy, a value-based strategy is really the only viable way for growth. So the next question is, well, we've established that, okay, value-based pricing is the best way to go, and we know that it's no longer optional but necessary. We're really down to the key question of this webinar, which is, how long should it take? And there are at least two perspectives about this. And on the left, and here we're quoting from a recent article, but I've heard this point of view expressed several times, and especially at pricing conferences, that it's a massive change management initiative. It's long, it's painful, it's tedious, and it takes multiple years to do. Now, needless to say, you know, a message like this probably doesn't win many converts to taking on a value-based pricing initiative. And to be fair, this does reflect the enormous challenges of, you know, turning around a large-scale organization. But is there a better way? And the answer we want to propose is yes, we think there is. You know, think about many companies that do dramatic and rapid turnarounds. And on a smaller scale, in terms of beginning to see the fruits of a value-based strategy, it is entirely feasible to expect some results in the first year. And that's really part of, well, really the main part of that chapter that we contributed to the ROI of Pricing book this year. So what I want to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is to tell the story in order to explain, you know, how this actually works. And the secret, or at least the approach that we take, is what we call Agile deployment. And essentially what this means is that we're taking the same methodology that we use to develop our software and apply that to working with our customers. And as many of you know, Agile is the industry standard method for developing internet software. And it really explains why there's an explosion of web-based applications and mobile apps today. So in applying it to our topic today, I want to talk about 5 key factors you need to have in order to deploy a value-based strategy. Choosing where to start is next. Then I'd like to share some best practices for increasing adoption and momentum. And then lastly, and I know that many people are interested in this, is well, how do you track the ROI of a value-based approach? So first, just to set a little context for those who are unfamiliar with Agile, and of course, as always, you know, Dilbert nails a certain truth about the subject. So it starts off with the pointy-haired boss talking about to his staff, we're going to try something called Agile programming, and goes on to explain that it means no more planning and no more documentation and just start writing code and complaining. And then Wally says, I'm glad it has a name. And then the pointy-haired boss says, that was your training. So that's not the training I'm going to leave you with. I'm hoping I can add a little bit more to what's really going on here. And I think the best way to talk about this is to compare Agile to what's called the traditional Waterfall method. So way back earlier in my career, you know, I worked as a consultant and I did a lot of systems implementation work with large telco companies. And this was in the area of customer service and order provisioning systems. And these were really large undertakings. I mean, the end-to-end project did take years. And it went through, stages very much like this. And the thing about these stages is that, water flows down, it never goes back up again. So you can't reverse the flow. In other words, that, the screens of these applications, and some of them were actually green, and I think some of the older folks know what a green screen is. Those screens were actually frozen in time several months before they were actually used. And things were very rigid and and locked, but it was a system that worked very well for many years. It was slow, it was inflexible, it was buggy, but it worked, most of the times. So sort of like, Microsoft Windows, say. But today, we're in a cloud mobile world, and software is developed much more differently. And the mantra is more like, build it, break it, fix it, but do it very quickly. And these development cycles are called sprints. And sprints can be as quick as a week. At LeveragePoint, we use a monthly release cycle. And what this does is it allows developers to respond to users' demands almost in real time. And actually, users today really expect software to continuously improve each time they enter it. They don't want to wait for releases. They just want to see improvements over time. So what I want to do here is talk about, okay, so what does this mean in terms of deploying a value-based pricing strategy? Well, there are a number of things here that I think can be applied to that task. And they all have the common themes of being very well focused, somewhat short-term, so weekly, and this whole idea of iteration. So that is, not coming up with a grand solution, but focus on fixing a particular issue in a short period of time, not worrying for the perfect solution, but the best situation at the time, test it and fix it. So let me give you a little background about the case study here that we're basing this on. And again, this comes from that book chapter that Paul mentioned, and you may have a chance to get a copy of this book. There's some other great chapters in that book as well. But in terms of the case study that we developed, we chose 4 of our large B2B enterprises that were successful in deploying a value-based approach using this Agile method. And they were across a variety of industries. They were in the chemicals, food, energy, and high-tech verticals. They had a large group of members, somewhere between 50 to 200. And they were all globally focused, and they were all focused on capturing more value and measuring the impacts of that. So what we saw that was common across all these deployments are 5 key success factors. Now, many of you will recognize these as being just good change management discipline. But they really take on a real important role in this approach, based on my experience here. And the first one is, obviously, there has to be a strong commitment to value. And nowadays, this is very common. And most large B2B companies today have some mission statement related to value. It's either in their shareholders reports or on their web page. But clearly, there has to be a signal. And these are usually the companies that do invest in R&D and are looking for a return on their investment. So usually the leaders and the companies that are innovating in their markets do have a commitment to value. They may not call it a value-based strategy, but they certainly have the mindset for that. So that's absolutely important to have in place. A second one is to have a proactive project manager to really keep that sprint going. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. A third is to quickly create a core group of what we would call power users or converts, those who can actually serve as a role model and to spread out the best practices there. Fourth, putting it into the workflow. I think a lot of times when there are new initiatives, there's this tendency to think that we have to stop work, learn something, and then go back to work. No, that doesn't work. This has to be part of the workflow. So if you're developing new products that have value, you better have a value-based approach embedded in that stage gate process. If you're responding to competitive threats, then you better have that type of approach in here. So embedding it into the existing workflows is very, very important. We're not trying to layer on something new. We want to integrate it with what's existing. And then finally, having what we would call a choiceful phased deployment. You're not going to turn everything on the same day. Different groups will come on board, and you have to decide who goes first. So let's talk about where to start. And I mentioned weekly sprints. So I'm sorry. So we'll talk about where we start. So let's just say we're beginning a new pricing initiative. So these are sort of the checklist of things that we look for when we start working with a customer. So we try to find the, quote, best value opportunities. Which ones do we want to start with? Ideally, I think the sweet spot are middle stages of an innovative product launch. You know, we start sometimes far earlier, and we certainly start later. But somewhere in the middle where you're really putting together the go-to-market strategy is a great place to begin. Highly complex, highly competitive situations, do-or-die situations, especially if a company has never taken value seriously before, is a little bit too little too late. So you want to find those best opportunities, and every company has those at some point of time. In that blue box here, you'll see a quote and this is actually from a customer from the case study. You know, we have to start somewhere, and our somewhere was the new product that felt right for us. The second place to start is to choose the right teams, and we recommend somewhere between 2 to 3 teams. That is, each team working on a particular product or offer configuration. The ideal teams are cross-functional, because here we're not talking about simply a pricing expert putting things together, but pulling in product, marketing, sales, R&D. And the commitment, although it's weekly, is relatively light. We're talking about a couple hours a week, but sustained sort of focused work. And there has to be some sort of senior management visibility in terms of their progress. So that gets into the weekly cycle. And then you define what those success criteria are, and then you put it to a schedule. So this is what I was getting at before about weekly sprints. And so this is a typical type of a plan for a first cycle of rollout. So you'll notice that each week there are some specific tasks, and they're very, very focused, and they have a common goal. And what we find is very effective is mixing in some of the training with what we call coaching. And so this is a little bit of a different approach than I've seen other companies do. This is not a workshop where someone comes in, gives you a deep dive on all the techniques in a day or two, leaves, and then you're left to figure out how to apply it. This is all about applied learning right off the bat. So it's not academic, it's applied. The other thing about it is different than a situation where you can bring in outside experts who put together a strategy and leave it behind and have you figure it out. So here, it's all about getting the teams engaged in the process. And once that 60-day plan is done, it can either be extended or replicated with other teams, or it can be put in as part of a quarterly plan. So those are some of the nuts and bolts in here. And as Paul mentioned, we're going to be providing you the slides for this, so you can almost look at this as a guide to how to put together a value-based pricing approach. Now, in terms of some of the best practices that we've seen with customers, is that the program manager is really, as I said, it's a key factor. And what is it that they do? Well, as one of our customers says, you know, someone has to be the driver. They have to share success. They have to generate interest. You need to have that. So our best program managers, and I could think of several that we have the pleasure of working with, they are relentless in terms of communicators. They communicate up, they communicate down, they communicate laterally. And it's always sort of what I would call nudging the teams, making sure that they stay on task, providing the resources that they need. And they also have to be the spokesperson to talk about the work that folks are doing and the wins that they have. They're also very, very good at developing what I call internal promotions. We've had at least a few of our customers have what they call Value Day. They're sort of like internal events. Sometimes they can have some elements of competition. They can have some prizes. We've had other customers who tap into their social media platforms internally. That helps. And then, of course, you know, putting that as a required deliverable in embedding in process really helps. And stage gate is a very natural one. There are a lot of stage gate processes that have pricing and value embedded in it. So it's a really great place to have that in there. And really, what you want to do is, as the program leader, what you're trying to do here is not so much become the internal expert. It's not about having internal expert. It's about everybody having some level of expertise. That's what we're doing here. And by that, you'll be able to cover a lot more ground quickly. And that bottom quote actually really gets at that. We had a customer that we worked with who was feeling that they were becoming an internal expert. Whenever their team had a question, they would go back and ask. And finally, this person said, look, I'm not available. You need to work with your fellow coaches. It was a very tough love approach, but this was a company that has been probably one of our most successful case studies to date. Now, I have a real-world example here, and a few months ago, we had the opportunity of having Patrick Moss from Schneider Electric, which is a global multi-billion-dollar supplier of energy management products and services, talk about some of the details around his journey and making this happen. And it's a great story. I'm not going to recreate it here, but if you see that little link on the bottom, we have that webinar recorded. So if you're looking for an actual case study of this working, you can see that. But this slide here talked about how this got embedded into their own process. So every company has its own flavor of doing it, but they all are successful by embedding it. All right, so now let's talk about measuring and tracking ROI. So there's a number of dimensions you can look at. You know, ROI is one of those things that if you plan for it and you actually take the time to measure it, you can get some measures. It's hard to do it after the fact. You need to sort of build that in as part of your process. So what we generally do is, because we use LeveragePoint to quantify value, it's pretty normal to actually add up that potential value. And so I'll show you an example of that. Second, you need to make sure that those value stories that the teams develop actually get tested. And they can be tested in a variety of ways. Internally, we've had it done with management teams. We've done it with sales channels. We've had it with country marketing managers. But basically, you have to get some sort of reality check to how well the value is really validated. And sometimes people do it with customers. And then lastly, the program manager needs to get feedback from the team members themselves. And these are some of the guiding questions that, that we usually look for. Now, here's an example of a slide that I like to do with all of our customers who start working with LeveragePoint. Now, this is a very sanitized slide. So everything, all the information here is been changed to protect. But in this particular case, we actually had 5 teams, and you'll notice that they worked on 5 different types of offerings. They all had their value management channels, and you could see by the currencies they were in different markets, U.S. and in Europe. And what we found was, and this comes straight out of the application, we're able to find how much value was identified. In other words, how much customer value were the teams able to find. And often they find more than they initially thought they had. So that's an important takeaway. I think having a platform where people can just focus in on value, not figure out how to build things or apply, allows people to do some very good, creative, solid thinking about customer value, and do it very efficiently and to share that. So you'll notice here, these are pretty typicals, but what I find is really interesting is what's the potential annualized value. And you see that the numbers here add up very, very quickly. Now, that's not to say that all of this information is going to suddenly appear on this customer's bottom line, but this does give a goal to try to capture more of this value. So as you can see, and this is the best part, I think, of my job, is finding and actually adding up the numbers. So we're not talking theory here. We're talking about real business opportunities. Another way we like to look at adoption, and this is something that you're able to do when you're using a software platform, is to look at what we call adoption metrics. That is, how often are people engaging and collaborating here. So if you look at these, especially the last column, usage transactions, these are when people are either working on a value model or looking up information or downloading information or something. You'll see that within, a span of a few months to a year, you're having lots of transactions. Each one of those transactions, in a sense, is a point where somebody is thinking about value. And I haven't had a chance to update this, but those numbers have gone increasingly higher. And that's a nice thing of having it on the platform as opposed to, sort of isolated spreadsheets where you have no idea what people are using. So what I'm going to show here is, this is a list of some of the value drivers that we use to actually build value models for this approach. And so you'll see 3 specific value drivers here, and here I'm modeling some of the best practices that we like to pass to our customers, which is, well, what do you get out of doing this? So we see 3 big areas: better product pricing decisions, higher success rates in new product introductions, and reduced planning time. And so the logic and actually the variables for that are kind of laid out here. So again, think of this as a reference. In the ROI case study that we have in the book, we actually put some numbers here. And so we did what I call a pro forma for a typical type of customer. And here, again, showing best practices, we documented all of our sources. So some of this stuff comes directly from the customer interviews we did for the case studies, and other are from publicly available information. And this is really how value models are created for our customers. They go through the same type of process, combination of secondary information and primary sources. And what comes out of that, and I think some of you may have seen this before, so we start putting the numbers to that, you'll see that the ROI is quite high for an initial investment. I would say ridiculously high in many respects. And this is showing the opportunities of executing on value. So, actual mileage may vary, as they say in the car commercials, but at least it gives you a target by which you could show what you could get if you can scale a value-based pricing approach across an organization. And I think one of the big takeaways here is it gives salespeople a lot more confidence in communicating value. And I think the number one issue, and I think this is something that came up in our previous webinar on value-based selling, is that confidence is a big barrier to capturing value. And so having this information in the salespeople's hands where they know that the value is pretty much documented is a very powerful thing. So these are reference slides which we'll include in the package that we sent out to you. So just to show you that we're totally transparent about the math on the values, I provide all of those things here. So what I want to do right now is kind of wrap up. Those are the quantitative values, but there are some intangible success factors that we've gotten out of from our customers themselves. Some of the things that we hear is, okay, we've got faster and deeper deployment than we've had before, and we've had better adoption, and we've had higher consistency. I think having people on a standard, structured approach really helps people quite a bit. And there's more of an alignment that sort of matches up with the company intends to do strategically to what it delivers. So I know I covered a lot of ground quickly, but the details, again, are well covered in Chapter 12. I'll also point out that we have a very deep blog on LeveragePoint. It's not just us, but it's a community with a number of pricing experts. So we have contributions from Tom Nagel and John Hogan, and then recently Mike Wilkinson added something. Stefan Liozu is a regular contributor. We really pull in a lot of expertise on a variety of topics, including value-based deployment. So feel free to jump into the blog or even ask questions there. We can respond to them. Our website has additional white papers, and I mentioned a few of the webinars that we've done in the past, which I think are good resources as well. So hopefully with all of that, you'll have with this in the presentation, you'll have some things that you can inspire you to begin putting together a sprint of your own. And of course, if you have any questions about that, more than happy to talk with you about it. So I have my contact information there as well. So I think at this point I'll turn it back to Paul and see if there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Ed. That was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot, actually, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. We do have a lot of questions that have come in. There's still an opportunity to have some questions added to the list. So you could do that by entering the question panel. Also, please do give us your thoughts on this webinar by completing the 3-question survey, which will appear after you leave the webinar. We do value this feedback and have used information from these surveys to choose webinar topics and enhance programming in general. Now, before we get to the question and answers, I did want to build upon Ed's points and show an example of a typical customer experience. LeveragePoint is a cloud-based application that allows everyone in the enterprise to efficiently collaborate on a number of value-based activities. And when I say efficient, I mean all the data is kept in one place, totally secured and organized for people to search and reuse the best data. This enables product, marketing, and pricing to build out value models so they can make better strategic decisions, whether it's product development, offer definition, market segmentation, competitive response, or pricing. You have a common structured platform where teams can collaborate efficiently and effectively. And after strategic decisions have been made, you have an excellent content repository for customer-facing teams to access value-based marketing and sales materials and give them more confidence in communicating your differentiation. Plus, as a cloud-based application, both sides are linked for continuous improvement and to gather the latest field intelligence. And that's certainly a tremendous advantage that allows even the largest of organizations to develop and execute a value-based pricing strategy very nimbly. Ed, back to you for the questions and answers.
So I think the gist of this question is, so what do you do if you're a company that is facing strong competition and a cost? So there's a couple of factors here. If you have competition with Me Too products, and actually we've had previous webinars around it where say you're a company that innovates on value, and very, very quickly you've got a Me Too competitor that's undercutting you, right? So the value approach is actually a great way to respond to that, because when you think about customer value, it's a lot more than the core part of the offer. It's everything else that your brand represents. So I worked with a company once, and one of the European managers basically put it this way: you know, you can buy the cheaper device, but if that equipment breaks down in Spain on a weekend, who's going to fix it? And what he was saying is that, you know, yes, they have cheaper competitors, but the reason why his brand or his company's value was superior was more than just the equipment, although the equipment was very, very good, but it was also all the services and the reliability and all those things there. So those definitely can be factored into a value messaging. And, you know, if you're in a cost pricing mode, it's really, really important, especially for your more strategic types of products, especially the products where you're really going to be betting your growth on, to take that approach. There may be some mature products. This was something that I know Patrick talked about, where he triaged his products and said, we're really focusing our deployment, at least initially, on the value or the high, or what he calls revolutionary value products. The commodity ones, he, although I disagreed with him on this, at least in the short term, still have you know, the sort of traditional pricing methods. So hopefully that gave you some insights there. All right, so let me look at the next question here. Can value models be connected to Salesforce.com? Oh, that's a great question. Yes, of course. Salesforce.com is a web app, a very successful one that we try to emulate in some respects, and we do support integration with Salesforce.com, and it's a great functionality. So the answer to that is yes. All right, some other questions that we have. You know, you talk about new products. Is this only for new products? No, it's not only for new products. I mean, many of our customers start in new products because strategically that's where the growth and the highest opportunity for value capture is. But in reality, we have companies that take existing products into new markets, for example. That's a very typical use case. We have companies that are being attacked by new aggressive competition, just like we referenced in the previous question. That's another situation. So any type of product lends itself to a value-based approach, and is worth doing. So absolutely, it doesn't have to be new products. One other question is, where did you see companies fall? I'm sorry, let me just digest. Where did you see companies fail to do value selling, and what has been the root cause? Okay, that's a really good question, and I think I wish we had Mike Wilkinson here to answer on the value selling. So, you know, I really think that part of the issue is in the collaboration between what we call the marketing and product side with the sales side. So, you know, when I've seen instances where you would have even people doing the right things on the value strategy side pretty much dump it into a salesperson's lap and say, here, go sell value, stop discounting. And that certainly does not work. So, this same agile approach also applies to sales deployment as well. And especially on the sales side, nothing succeeds like success. In other words, if you can, again, pick those teams that are, if you handpick those teams that have the highest chance of success with very strategic products, very quickly you'll have many people trying to emulate that success. So kind of building in that agile method to sales deployment, I think is a good thing. I think this sort of waiting to create a perfect value model and then just throwing it over the wall globally all at one time, I think is a very, very risky move. So I think agile is a great way to do with sales. All right, so another question. So what's the time commitment for people to do value-based pricing approach? People are very, very busy, and I hear this all the time, and that's true. I mean, companies have really cut back, and people are working 2 or 3 jobs now, and time is very limited. I think with the agile approach, at least what I was trying to get across here is that this isn't something that is a diversion from your job. It is your job. If you're responsible for the success of a new product launch and you want to make sure that you're capturing as much value for shareholders, then you ought to be thinking value in some way. And if that's the case, then I think this method, especially combined with a platform, which really eliminates a lot of the the time sinks of losing information and having inconsistent information and not being able to find information. I think if you combine those 2 practices together, you've got a very, very powerful combination that's going to save you time. It's not a diversion. This approach is all about application on day one. And really, in my practices, it's really a few hours a week, every week, and you'll get better. It's just like any type of a skill. If you practice it frequently, you will definitely get better. So some advice there. Let me just look over and see if there are any other questions. We've got one more, so why don't we take this last one here and we'll wrap up. How important is customer research in measuring economic value, and what methods do you recommend? Wow, another excellent question. So, and I was almost expecting to hear the word conjoint here, because that usually comes up in some way. So conjoint is one research method for getting customer feedback. I'll tell you what I think can be very, very effective, and that is in doing some customer testing with value propositions. That is, once you have your value story put together and you've got some very crisp value hypotheses that you want to test, I think depth interviews, face-to-face customer interviews where you're testing some specific hypotheses. This is how we're thinking about your operations. Are these some of the operational issues that you're dealing with? How are you dealing with them today? And would you be interested in seeing a different approach to it and what the result of that is? I think those types of focused face-to-face interviews or mini focus groups are incredibly powerful. And I think more so than a lot of the other types of research that are out there, because it's immediate, it's in the moment, it's in the context of a customer's business. So I think, when we look back to some of our roots at LeveragePoint, and we can trace ourselves back to the strategic pricing group, that was the type of work that they would do all the time, asking a lot of questions to customers, depth interviews, and really testing hypotheses and continually refining those and testing those. That type of methodology I think we can support very, very easily with our platform. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Paul?
Yep. Thanks, Ed. That was a great presentation once again, very informative. And more importantly, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. You will all receive an email within the next 2 days, which will have a link to both the on-demand recording as well as the slide deck. So be on the lookout for that. And also, don't forget your chance to win a copy of the popular ROI of Pricing just by completing that brief 3-question, 10-second survey, which will appear as soon as you exit the webinar. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.